Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Facebook Live edition of Stories of Preservation and Progress, coming to you this month uh, from Zoom and Facebook. So, thank you all so much for joining us. Today, we have with us Dr. Stephen Farnsworth. He is a professor of political science and international affairs and the director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at the University of Mary Washington. He is co author or author of 7 books and an award winning educator. In addition to his books, Dr. Farnsworth has also authored and co authored dozens of scholarly articles on such topics as the presidency, the mass media, U.S. public opinion, and Virginia politics. And his political commentary has appeared in a wide range of media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, Politico, C SPAN, and BBC World. Dr. Farnsworth, who's also affiliate faculty in communication and digital studies and American studies at UMW, has taught courses in political science, journalism, and political communication at Georgetown University, McGill University, George Mason University, and Methodist College, Kuala Lumpur. So we're excited to have this international scholar with us today to talk to us a bit about very timely topic, the Electoral College. And with that, I'm going to, before we get started, I also want to encourage people as we're going, please feel free to leave questions for Dr. Farnsworth in the comments, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. So with that, Dr. Farnsworth, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm so glad to be here to talk with all of you today about the Electoral College. Little did we know when we set this up that it would be as timely a topic as it is. I want to say one thing at the outset, though, that this has not been a talk that was uh, vetted by the city of Manassas or by Rachel. So if you have any problem with anything I say, you have a problem with me. And so with that, let me just turn to a few PowerPoint slides to sort of help us go through the conversation of where we are and where we've been with respect to the Electoral College. Now, I think it's important to remember that, when we often talk about the genius of the founders, when you actually look at the transcripts of the conversations during the Constitutional Convention, the notes that were taken at the time, it's clear that they were often struggling to put things together. This is a political system that was largely developed from the vision of political theorists and from past experience, but a lot of the things that they did in Philadelphia in 1787 were things that had not been tried before. And one of them was the Electoral College. And so, but by the way, if you look at specifically what they wrote about in 1787 regarding the Electoral College, it's clear that it was one of those things where they had really not come up with a good plan for selecting a president. They had sent it to a committee, they had sent it to another committee. They were ready to get out of town at the end of the Constitutional Convention, and they still hadn't really worked out a plan. So appreciate that among the moments of genius that the founders had in the Constitution, there were also moments of struggling to get something done at the last minute. And the Electoral College was one of those things that had been part of the postponed matters was the term that they used. Now, in some ways, they had run out of alternatives. The founders were a bit concerned about giving the public too much direct control. And so there was a great deal of anxiety about just basically having a popular election or something like that. So what they decided to do was create something that was going to function not unlike the system of the College of Cardinals, which is Catholics use to select the Pope. They evaluate the top candidates for national office. And in Federalist 68, Hamilton talked in particular about the Electoral College as a mechanism for allowing kind of a peer review process. The people in politics, people who knew a little bit about some of these people, would perhaps be the wise, outstanding, virtuous citizens that could select the president. Now, that was the vision, but it almost immediately become something else. Um, the founders did not build in the Constitution a system that gave specific authority to political parties, but partisan electors and partisanship generally very quickly comes to dominate the political process. By 1800, the first real challenge to the electoral system, it had become very much a tool of partisan ratification, not of expert evaluation of presidential candidates. Now, I'll say a few things about the general ideas of the positive and the negative aspects of the Electoral College, and then talk about some of the other issues. But it's important to recognize some of the assets that you would see with the Electoral College. One of the ideas that we saw historically, although this is a little bit more problematic an argument to make in the wake of the last several presidential elections, is that the Electoral College may magnify a popular vote margin. If you think, for example, back to the election of Obama in 2008, the margin of popular vote was smaller than the margin of electoral votes in terms of percentage. And so, and that historically is often the case, that what the Electoral College does is takes a popular vote that is relatively close to 50-50, but creates a magnification of that popular vote preference. Now, we've seen, of course, some Electoral College outcomes that differed from the popular vote lately, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But certainly one of the ideas that the founders and the early proponents of the Electoral College had was that it would magnify the popular vote margin. And that may make it easier to govern. Another idea was that the Electoral College would limit the impact of corruption, an action of corruption, to a single state. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that a particular state, let's call it Illinois, is under the control of a political machine. Let's call it the Daily Machine. Now, if you imagine how the Daily Machine might be able to count ballots in urban areas in Chicago, that would have an impact in statewide election totals. And perhaps there might be some issues of the choices that the political machine makes in terms of corrupting the political process. But whatever the Daily Machine's impact within Illinois, the Daily Machine had no ability to manipulate the Electoral College votes of Wisconsin or Indiana or neighboring states. And so if there is an element of corruption in some individual state, it would really be limited to that individual state. And so the political machines that we've had across American history have really been very municipal specific, that is state specific as well. So the impact of a political boss in Chicago or in Kansas City or in Providence, those impacts are only within those states. Now, that is part of the vision. Now, one of the things that we also see as we look at the Electoral College, and this perhaps is less positive, is that we really end up with a conversation that is not at all a national conversation. You look at individual states that are swing states, and both campaigns very quickly will make a decision about whether a state is competitive or not. If your party is obviously going to win that state or obviously going to lose that state, it's a waste of time and money to invest anything in that state. Now, for years, of course, Virginia, solidly Republican, was not a state that was at the middle of the Electoral College calculation. As recently as 2004, John Kerry and Al Gore in 2000 and Bill Clinton in 96, not one of those Democrats thought Virginia was worth making a run at. Of course, in 2008, 2012, 2016, we were in some ways the belle of the ball. We'd gotten a lot of attention from the Electoral College dynamics. We were a swing state, and we got a lot of candidate visits. We had a lot of campaign money spent in the state. And, you know, for political scientists, we love to see the political ads, but maybe for some of the voters, it was a bit too much. But if that was your preference, in 2020, you got your wish, because we now are seen as more reliably blue in Virginia, and neither campaign, the Trump campaign nor the Biden campaign, invested a great deal in Virginia. Trump made a few campaign appearances here, Pence did too, but it was never a priority. It was just we were convenient. Now, there has been a lot of frustration in public and public opinion and in political circles about the Electoral College. There have been more than 700 attempts in various pieces of legislation to abolish or amend the Electoral College going back to its founding. But we've really only made a couple of simple changes in terms of the law. There's a separate vote for president and vice president in the Electoral College. That's part of the 1800 issue I'll bring to your attention in a moment. And then we've given the District of Columbia electors the only jurisdiction, not a state, to have electoral college. But it's very hard to amend the Electoral College. And so, and of course, it's also very difficult to get something through Congress with supermajorities. And so efforts to try to abolish or amend the Electoral College almost certainly are going to be facing significant opposition. But let me talk a minute about some of the things that have gone wrong with respect to historical dynamics of the Electoral College, or at least created controversies if they haven't gone wrong. So in 1800, when you cast two ballots, the first place person would be the president, the second place person would be the vice president. But because it had become an intensely partisan process, the Electoral College of 1800 and the years that followed, there was a tie. Although Burr was Jefferson's running mate, they tied because everybody who backed Jefferson also backed Burr. And in the end, Jefferson wins. And the 11th Amendment separates the electoral votes for president and vice president. Because they hadn't envisioned strong political parties along the lines of the way they emerged almost immediately, the framers of the Constitution did not prepare for what obviously would happen in an intensely partisan environment, a tie between the two candidates. Now, in 1824, Andrew Jackson led in both the popular vote and the electoral votes in the five-candidate field. John Quincy Adams, however, wins in the House and becomes president. And Jefferson argued, or Jackson rather, argued there was a corrupt bargain here, that John Quincy Adams had made a deal with Henry Clay, who was also a candidate for president and Speaker of the House, to make sure that things tilted John Quincy Adams' way. Adams and Clay both denied there was any corrupt bargain involved, but once Adams becomes president, the same Henry Clay becomes Secretary of State. So you can draw your own conclusions there. In 1876, Samuel Tilden, a Democrat, won a majority of the popular vote and finished first in the electoral vote if we take out the 20 contested votes that were out there. In the end, Southern Democrats backed Rutherford B. Hayes for president in 1876 because Rutherford B. Hayes promised to remove federal troops that were continuing to occupy the South after the Civil War. And of course, once those federal troops were removed, one by one, the southern states, the former Confederate states, reinstituted basically a Jim Crow system as it came to be known. Then, in more recent, examples of electoral college, we might call it a misfire, is the term that I tend to use, where the popular vote and the electoral vote give us a different outcome. This occurred in 1888 with Grover Cleveland. But it was relatively close, 90,000 vote difference. It happened in 2000, Al Gore with a 500,000 vote popular vote margin. But the Electoral College was decided by Florida and by 437 votes out of 6 million cast in Florida. In 2016, Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million, but loses the Electoral College after losing Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by a combined margin of 80,000 votes. And again, this is a very, very narrow margin. Now, in 2020, we had a near miss, I guess we could say. Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million, that margin. And he... if we had seen 11,000 votes in Arizona and 12,000 votes in Georgia and 20,000 votes in Wisconsin, a total of less than 50,000 votes, if they had flipped, the Electoral College would have been tied 269 to 269. And then it would have gone to the House. And if you think we had trouble in 2020 with the election being contested as it was, imagine what would have happened in the House with players of 2020 in a tie electoral college environment. To give you sort of a sense of how this works is it really does come down to just a few places. These are the calculations of the swing states, and the way I like to describe it is to look at it in the context of where the Republicans have won historically. So the victories for the Democratic ticket in Arizona and Georgia were pretty extraordinary. Republicans had won the last 4 elections in a row. Barack Obama didn't win either one of those states. And then if you look at the 3 electoral college wins leading between 2004 and 2016, North Carolina, which went Republican this time, had gone Republican 3 out of 4 in the previous elections. Nebraska too. Nebraska and Maine, as you know, they separate some of their electoral votes for the individual congressional districts in the state. Biden won Nebraska too, which is the urban district around Omaha. Now, the states that Republicans had won twice in that period of time between 2004 and 2016, Florida and Ohio, Trump won both of those again. Trump won the rural outback northern Maine district, Maine too, but he did lose the 3 states that had flipped his way after a series of Democratic victories. They flipped his way in 2016: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the states we talked about before. Now, in 2016, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were all decided by less than 1%. In Wisconsin in 2020, it was also decided by less than 1%. The Arizona and Georgia were also very close in 2020. So when you think about how the Electoral College is working today, the argument that it is magnifying the popular vote outcome is a difficult argument to make. We've had since 2000 and 2016 2 examples of the popular vote giving us a different outcome than the electoral vote. And in 2020, we came pretty close to the same thing. So that is a potential issue that will be out there. It's also, I think, and this was an issue that a number of conservative Republicans raised with respect to President Trump's effort to contest the Electoral College. Congressman Massey of Kentucky, for example, is one of the more vocal voices here, saying that if President Trump continues to argue about the Electoral College the way that he did, this was in the days between the election and between the riot on January 6th, he said, you're really creating an environment where there's going to be more pressure than ever to get rid of the Electoral College. And so some conservative Republicans are very concerned that the Trump strategy of trying to convince the Congress not to accept the electoral votes of these states and to try to pressure the election officials in individual states to just simply find additional votes for Trump creates an environment that really undermines the appeal of the Electoral College. And undermining the appeal of the Electoral College, Congressman Massey argues, is not in the interests of Republicans, given the fact that Democrats have won the popular vote in both of the elections involving President Trump, as well as every election since 2000, except 2004, when George W. Bush runs in shortly after the 9/11 attacks, and of course the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, one potential challenge with respect to the Electoral College is whether we might see it as a deterrent to people voting, whether they participate or not. So I'll give you the good news and the not so good news. If you think about how voting turnout worked out for America in 2020, you can see that we had an extraordinary high level of voter turnout, 66.5%, far higher than the enthusiasm that greeted any candidate, higher than the turnout for Reagan, higher than the turnout for Barack Obama, higher than the turnout in that 3-candidate race of 1992 with George H.W. Bush, Ross Perot, and Bill Clinton. Significantly higher turnout. It's what we have here. This measure produced by the University of Florida involves voting eligible turnout, and so this number only includes those people who could register to vote. And so in some states that have same-day registration, it would be all the people who could be eligible to vote. In other states, it would be only those people who could be who are eligible to turn out in terms of, say, for example, if there's a barrier under state law for convicted felons, those would not be considered voting eligible persons. If you're a convicted felon, you can't vote in a given state. This is common across the South, as you know. Then you would not be considered part of the voting eligible population. And I think this is probably a better measure than some of the others that you might see that talk about percentage of people over 18 who are citizens who could participate or not, because it does take into account that at the last minute some people might not be able to vote, and of course at the last minute as well, or even before that, the folks with convicted records of felonies in some states would not be eligible to vote whenever they wanted to register. But if you compare the United States to other countries, particularly the advanced Western democracies to which we often compare ourselves, the G20, the G7, the OECD, you see that we don't do so well. We did a lot, and this uses voting age population. So the number is a little different here than on the previous slide. You can see that there is a potential issue here in terms of voter turnout, because when you look at 2016, and particularly when you look at 2020, it's clear that this was a very intense election, very motivated voters on both sides, high level of salience. But in a lot of states, your vote, quote, might not matter for the presidential election, because if you think about, say, Maryland, obviously the Democrats were going to win Maryland. It's not a contestable state. It hasn't been for decades. Similarly, if you think about West Virginia, the Republicans were clearly going to win West Virginia, and there wasn't much of a point in a presidential election decision to participate for a voter, particularly maybe during COVID when they didn't want to stand in line or deal with the complexities of voting in 2020. They might not say that it's worth it for them to participate, because Donald Trump was obviously going to win West Virginia, Joe Biden was obviously going to lose West Virginia, and so the impact might be a bit different. Now, the challenge, I think, for the issue that Congressman Massey raised, I just wanted to offer up a little data on that point. And the issue here is a question of whether or not people approved of Trump supporters taking over the Capitol. And you'll note that even among Republicans, it wasn't that popular. You see that there was only 13% approval in the country. This survey was taken right before Biden was inaugurated, so it was started. The survey's window started 10 days after the riot or insurrection, whatever word you like, and ended the day before Biden was inaugurated. So you can see here just an overwhelmingly high level of disapproval from Democrats, but also a very high disapproval rating among Republicans. And then the question of whether or not President Trump incited his supporters to engage in this violence. Democrats were quite convinced that it was the case that Trump incited supporters. Independents are split roughly 50-50. Republicans thought maybe that was not a key question, that he was not as responsible as the Democrats thought. Now, I bring this up to return to the point that Congressman Massey made, and he had other Republicans in his corner raising this same issue, that if we now have, of course, an end of 200 years of peaceful transfer of power. Once there was the riot on January 6th, we have to reset the clock on peaceful transfer of power. And the argument that Massey makes is that this is going to really, really be bad for the Electoral College. So as you can see, the dynamics here are pretty compelling from the point of view of disapproval across party lines. And so maybe this will be a one-off thing, that there won't be additional attacks on our political system. But in order to sort of frame the conversation going forward and the questions that people have, I'll give you a few ideas about what might be possible alternatives here. If one alternative, of course, is we keep the status quo. But if you're among those people, and that would be a majority of Americans who think the Electoral College should be adjusted or abolished, what might be the scenario that would be a possibility? One solution would be to abolish it entirely and have a national popular vote. That raises the possibility, though, that the corruption, say in Illinois, as I mentioned, in the Daley years, might be in a position to shape the outcome nationally. If the national popular vote were really close, the corrupt impact of a particular political machine might be even greater. I mean, if we had an election in 2000 where the national popular vote was 537, separating Al Gore and George W. Bush, every state in the Union probably would have been engaged in recounts and questioning the process of how the votes were conducted in their state as they tried to figure out a way to either overcome that 537 vote margin or increase it depending on the side you are in that case. Another possibility that people sometimes talk about is ending the unit rule. That is the idea of 48 states, it's a winner take all system. You have the possibility of the Maine and Nebraska scenario being replicated in the other 48 states. The way it's done in both of those states is that the overall popular vote winner in the state gets the 2 electoral votes that correspond to the senators. And then the individual House districts calculate their own winner in those congressional districts. So, for example, in the case of Maine, you have one congressional district that really is the more affluent part of Maine, coastal Maine, around Portland and Yarmouth and along the coast. And then you basically have a rural outback Maine that is a much more conservative part of Maine. And so Trump in 2016 and 2020 won the rural district and lost the urban district. He also lost the state as a whole. So the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Biden in 2020, won 3 electoral votes out of Maine, and the Republicans, Donald Trump, got 1 electoral vote. In Nebraska, the Republicans won 4 out of 5. There are 3 congressional districts there, other than Omaha. That went for 4 to 5 for Trump in 2016 and 1 electoral vote for Biden. If other states did this, first of all, it's not clear that the federal government could compel the other states to do this. It would require a constitutional amendment that the states themselves would have to agree to through ratification. But generally speaking, elections are under the control of state authorities, not national authorities. This is part of the reason why the federal government was not in a position to really leverage what Georgia was doing in terms of its recounting. It was up to Georgia state election authorities to make the calculation about who won the state. And, in all honesty, the election authorities in Georgia resisted significant pressure from the president to find votes, as we know. So you could do that sort of vote by congressional district. You could also do a proportional vote. Say if a state had like Virginia, if we had a 60-40 split, maybe we would have a 60-40 split in terms of electoral votes. And so rather than individual congressional districts, you could have some sort of proportional representation for the Electoral College. Again, that would probably take a constitutional amendment. States might or might not want to go with that. The abolition of the Electoral College has never seemed all that likely to me through the Constitution, because significant states do benefit from this system. If you look at the smaller states, pick Wyoming, 3 electoral votes. They have less than 700,000 people in Wyoming. So each person in Wyoming has a significantly greater share of the Electoral College vote than a person, say, who lives in California. Each electoral vote in California represents about 700,000 people. Each electoral vote in Wyoming represents less than 250,000 people. So that kind of disparity is certainly not what the founders envisioned. At the time of the founding, by the way, the largest state was only 12 times the smallest state in terms of population. Now the margin is more like 50 to 1 in terms of the population of the largest state, California, and the smaller states, Alaska, Vermont, Wyoming, that have just their 3 electoral votes. So that doesn't seem likely, because those small states will want to keep their disproportionate influence. And what also would happen, I suspect, would be that those individual swing states that get so much attention, your North Carolinas, your Georgias, your Arizona, they'd want the Electoral College kept because people pay a lot of attention to them when they're a swing state. So it'd be hard, I think, to get enough states to go along with it. You could theoretically break up the big states. There was talk about making 3 Californias. a Northern California, a Central California, and a Southern California. But that also runs into a constitutional problem because there is a constitutional provision that says no state shall be deprived of equal representation without its consent. So let's say Nevada might look at California and say, no, it's going to be one state because we have 2 of 100 senators. We don't want to have 2 of 104 senators. If we divide it 3 ways, there'd be 6 senators out of California, 2 representing Northern California, 2 Central, 2 Southern. So that doesn't seem likely to happen either. Another possibility is a runoff. That if the top 2 candidates had a second election, or we had instant runoff voting, something like that, we could perhaps come up with a different outcome if there was a disparity. You could perhaps create a bonus, right? I mean, if the popular vote winner got a bonus of 50 electoral votes or something like that, you could theoretically create an environment where the idea of a mismatch between the popular vote and the electoral vote would be less likely to occur. And then there's also another idea. And that would be a mechanism by increasing the size of the US House. If you increase the size of the House, say by 50 seats, which could be done without a constitutional amendment, by the way, you could create, again, more of an impact for population in the Electoral College calculation, less of an impact for the Senate side. And that could also create an environment where the Electoral College would be more likely to match up with the popular vote. And if you're a constitutional originalist, this idea of a larger House poses no problem. The average congressional district today represents 700,000 people. The average congressional district at the time of the founding, they represented 35,000 people apiece. Now, the last time the House was increased, a century ago, congressional districts were about a third of the size in terms of population that they are now. So we are clearly looking at much, much bigger congressional districts than the founders had in mind, or the people 100 years ago had in mind when they increased the size of the House at that time. So you could theoretically increase the size of the House. It could be 50, it could be 100, and that could be done with majority vote in the House and the Senate. And that could be a mechanism that would create an electoral college match that's more likely with the popular vote. So these are the possibilities that are out there. And one of the reasons why the Electoral College remains unchanged is the constitutional barrier, the difficulty of getting a constitutional amendment. The other one is the uncertainty among the people who want to see a change about what kind of change would be best. I just gave you a whole set of possible solutions, and those I think are particularly challenging when you think about how this might work out from the point of view of the consensus for changing the Electoral College. And so my guess is that we will be complaining about the Electoral College 50 years from now, hopefully peacefully, but the consequences of the founders' decision to make it very hard to change our election system creates a very powerful barrier against changes in the Electoral College system. That may be a positive thing, it may be a negative thing, depending on how you look at it, but it is a reality one way or the other. And so with that, let me turn it over to folks in terms of the questions. I'll stop the screen sharing here and look forward to your thoughts about what we might discuss.
That was amazing, Dr. Farnsworth. Thank you so much. I have copious notes here that I took during your talk, all sorts of things that I'm personally going to go forth and continue to research. One person, Mary Helen Dellinger, asked, she says, an increase to the House is interesting. Do you think that is a possibility given the climate today?
I think it would take bigger Democratic majorities, in all honesty. You have at the moment, at least, an unwillingness on the part of a couple of senators who are Democrats to abolish the filibuster. And so if the filibuster remains in place, this could not be handled without a 60-vote majority in the Senate. And that's so in the current environment, I don't see it happening. If you were to ask me for my personal preference, it's the one I kind of like because I think that it is a constant problem. The risk of an electoral college that tells us something else compared to the popular vote, I think that's a significant problem. And to the extent that we can reduce that risk, I think we should. Knowing how hard it is to change the Constitution, this strikes me as a more politically viable solution and a more politically palatable solution. Particularly when you think about sort of originalists and original intent and those kinds of things. But I don't see it happening in a 50-50 Senate that is not committed to abolishing the filibuster. But it is always a challenge. I tend to think that a number of House members would actually like this idea because if you think about how big some of these congressional districts are, it can be very, very difficult to represent such extraordinary large areas. In our area of Virginia, think about the 5th congressional district, which stretches from basically from the outer ring suburbs of Washington through Charlottesville and all the way down to the North Carolina border. That is a very, very big district, bigger in acreage than New Jersey, the entire state. This is the district that the Congressman Riggleman had been representing until recently, and Congressman Good represents it now. The reality is, if we had another congressional district or two, we would probably get lawmakers who we would see more, who would not have to represent such far-flung districts. Particularly if once you get out of metropolitan areas, Virginia congressional districts are huge. In Fredericksburg, where I live, we're in the 1st congressional district, and that stretches all the way down to Hampton Roads. From the southern edge of Prince William through Fredericksburg, all the way down the northern neck and middle peninsula into Hampton Roads. And Congressman Whitman, like many other members of Congress, have to represent a very far-flung district. And I think it would be easier for members of Congress if their districts were smaller. We might get more representative lawmaking, more opportunity to connect with them. I mentioned 50 as a number, but a case could be made that it should actually be 100 as an expanded House. We would have to build another building on Capitol Hill, but it would cost far less than many other things we do in government.
And that's as good a reason as any. I have a couple of questions I'm kind of curious about. Actually, so many questions. I wrote down so many questions while you were talking. One question is, has an elector ever gone rogue and voted the opposite of what their district voted?
Yeah, it happens. It happened in 2016, in fact. There were a number of Republican electors who had issues with President Trump. And so you saw individual electors who, in the case of, the term we use is faithless electors. That is, you are selected from the party list. The party selects the electors. So if Trump wins, these are the electors from Virginia. If Clinton wins, these are the electors from Virginia. So the parties are generally picking people who are committed to the party. But the issue with respect to this is I think an example of how this could work. In 2016, we had the largest number of faithless electors in over 100 years. There were 2 Trump voters, electoral voters, who didn't vote for Trump. They didn't flip to Hillary Clinton. They did. And there were 5 electoral voters for Clinton who also flipped, but did not flip towards Trump. They flipped towards other people who were out there. But there is in some states a law that says you have to vote for the candidate that you're pledged to by basis of your party selection. And so there were actually more faithless voters than those. These were the only officially recorded faithless electors. So there were a couple of other electors out there who were who were Republicans, but not Trump supporters. They were never Trumpers, and they wanted to vote for somebody else. But when that happens, in some states, you're simply automatically replaced by another elector who is committed, so as an alternative elector, if you will. Alternative electors already exist. People might die, right, between election day and the Electoral College convocation in the state capitals in mid-December. And so there are alternate electors. And those alternate electors were dropped in a number of states. So the number was actually higher than the 7 faithless electors of 2016, but some states had immediate replacement provisions under state law. But the reality is that faithless electors are just not in the, are not in the cards very frequently. The Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they are going to pick the most loyal, dependable people out there. But in the case of 2016, you remember there was that Access Hollywood tape. And so Trump, the candidate, looked very different on election day than he looked when he was nominated by the Republicans in the summer and when the Electoral College lists for the individual parties were created by those parties. So you can understand why people here and there who were Republican in their basic partisan loyalties might say that Trump is not suitable. For those people really interested in this, there's a great book. I have it at the ready here. It's called Representation in the Electoral College by Robert Alexander, a new book out of Oxford Press that really looks at this detailed study of the Electoral College. I'm assigning it this semester with my students, and so we'll have a lengthy conversation about it. I decided to add it to the course reading for the semester after we saw the post-November election controversies regarding the Electoral College.
Who is the author again? I can put it in the comment.
It's Robert Alexander. I'll get the book here. It's within arm's length. And you can see the cover, Representation and the Electoral College, Robert Alexander. It's Oxford Press.
Wonderful.
And it's a new book out in 2019.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions. We have one that would changing the selection of electors be a way to adjust the balance between the popular vote and the Electoral College?
Well, I suppose that's possible. I mean, there is this idea of a national compact. I suppose I should have mentioned that before in the options system, where individual states commit to sending their electors who would back the candidate who won the national popular vote. So, for example, if New York State would send obviously Democratic electors, it's a very Democratic state. But if the popular vote compact were in place, then they would send Republican electors those votes in those cases where a Republican presidential candidate won the popular vote. The provision here in that automatic system would require a majority of electoral votes to be committed to this system. So a number of states have to do that. And right now, there are not a majority of states that are committed to this Electoral College that puts together a slate of electors that match the national popular vote. It's something in the range of 230 electoral votes are covered by it by individual states. But basically, there is not much movement towards getting to 270. I think after 2020, that's particularly an unlikely scenario because we see the manipulation of individual state election officials being, I think, a realistic concern. I think the Electoral College Compact, as it's called, would only work if you could trust the other states. And I think it would be crazy for one state to trust the other states, particularly in the wake of 2020 and the very partisan manipulation that was attempted in terms of the post-election counting in various jurisdictions. That just doesn't strike me as a sound move. Virginia's legislature, by the way, is debating joining this compact, and just this week they tossed the bill out. So we're not considering it here in Virginia any longer this year, as far as the legislature is concerned right now.
Interesting. One more question, and then I want to throw in another one of my personal questions. So Mary Helen asked, do you think that with all the controversy surrounding this most recent election, that we have a somewhat more educated population in terms of how elections work?
Actually, I have one more slide. that relates to this point. I didn't use it because I thought we were, running a bit long. But let me share the screen, and I'll talk about that question with a bit of data.
Gotta love data.
Well, it's important.
I love it.
I have to. Okay. And this is again from a survey of mid-January, a national survey in the U.S. That asks about how people feel about the election. And what you see here is that the first question, how much confidence do you have in the 2020 election? You can see that Republicans had almost no confidence in this election, even after the Capitol riot, or insurrection, if you prefer. January 16 and 19 is the time of this survey. You can see that that only 9% of Republicans had a great deal of confidence that this election was held fairly. And you see 45% say none at all, and 20% of Republicans say only a little. And then the question about how much voter fraud do you think occurred in this election? Again, Republicans see 63% say a lot. For Democrats, 53% say none, only 8% say a lot. So what you see here is a clear bifurcation that is shaped by your partisan identity. And so, and this is, this gets to larger issues about misinformation, disinformation, fake news, the information that people have and their media channels, the news that they consume, the political figures that they respect. That information is very different from what other people receive who are looking at other media channels with other political leaders that they respect, who they listen to. We know factually that there were 60 plus court cases in some of the contested states about the counting procedures in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, 60 plus cases. And over again, the judges said there's no widespread electoral fraud. There's no evidence to support a claim that there are significant problems with the way the votes were counted in our individual states. These are judges at the federal level, judges at the state level. They provided no legal basis whatsoever for the claim that was being made that the election was being the subject of voter fraud. There was no support. They were Trump judges. They were Democratic judges. It didn't matter who appointed them. The word out of the court system was consistent: no fraud. And that's what courts do in our system, right? They adjudicate these differences of opinion. But that is fact. The court said there was no fraud. And yet, despite all those court rulings, you see a significant number of people convinced that there was fraud. Now, that is going to make it very difficult for Biden to govern. But it's also a reminder that people are not necessarily inclined to evaluate things on the basis of fact. I think one of the most powerful realities of our very divided time is this idea that what people want to believe is true, for them, it is true. And for a significant number of people, there is not enough evidence out there to convince them that this election was properly conducted, irrespective of what state election officials said, many of them, by the way, Republicans in some of these key swing states. What the court said, none of that matters. They're convinced there was fraud, even though there's no evidence there was indeed fraud. And so, and the data here, I think, are really, really powerful on this point. And that's I think, a real challenge for us going forward. I would like to believe that that voter education has been improved as a result of 2020, but I think a pretty compelling case could be made that it's actually worse than it usually is, because of the misinformation out there relating to the way this was handled after Election Day.
There's just a lot more sources for news, good, bad, and ugly, I suppose.
That's right.
Yeah. So I have just one last question for you, and then we're going to let you go. So I was particularly struck by your slide showing the voter turnout numbers in the US compared to other countries. What do you think where does that disparity come from?
Well, there are a variety of things. One of them is ease of registration. You know, a number of states have made it very difficult for people to participate. Other states have made it very easy. If you have same day registration, for example, um, some states have it, some states don't. If you have early voting with no excuses required, which we have now in Virginia, which historically we did not have, again, that makes it easier for people to participate. If you have more or fewer early voting opportunities, that creates an environment where people can make it easier to participate. I mean, the highest turnout in American elections are in states where you have basically the 100% no excuse required automatic mail-in of ballots. If you just drop them at a kiosk, you drop them in the postal service, you have this system that is it is effective, assuming there's no sabotage at the post office. But the reality is that if you have more opportunities for people to vote, they will. If you look at these other countries, most of them do not have compulsory voting. The other countries on that slide, they have a system like ours, but they make it easier for people to participate. They make it easier for them to vote. A number of countries on that list have voting mechanisms that are registration at the national level. So if you move, say, from Maryland to Virginia, you don't have to re-register to vote in Virginia. Your registration moves with you once you get your new driver's license, once you tell the Postal Service that you've moved. So those kinds of things can be done more automatically. Now, one of the things that's going on in Virginia right now is an effort to try to make this easier. I mean, we made it much easier to vote without an excuse required, of course, in the last couple of years. And COVID has encouraged Virginia and other states to make it much easier to participate in mail-in votes. So, our numbers are significantly higher. And a number of states had the same dynamic. Those states that took very seriously the healthcare risks of COVID and tried to figure out ways to let people vote other than standing in line on election day. And so those states had significant turnout. But in other cases, you didn't see such a high level of improvement. In Texas, for example, a model of course, how not to encourage voter participation, you saw a system where it was very hard to get your ballots in early. You had very few in the way of drop-off locations. You had situations that are very, very difficult for people to participate. And as a result, turnout isn't so good. One possibility, too, is that the Electoral College discourages turnout. I mean, I think it's possible to say that if you live in a reliably red or reliably blue state and you really only care about the presidential election, maybe you don't show up. If your side wins anyway, or your side won't win anyway, there's less incentive. Another possibility, I suppose, one of the other issues is out there, is the greater use of referendum. You have higher turnout in states that ask voters to make decisions about policy issues. We have in Virginia constitutional amendments out of the state constitution that go through the equivalent of a referendum system. If you think about the big issue that has been bedeviling Virginia over the last couple of years, issues of redistricting. We had in Virginia a constitutional amendment that allowed for a different system, the creation of a panel to evaluate where the district line should be for the House of Delegates and Congress and the Senate of Virginia. And that passed the voters, by the voters. But a lot of issues are handled by the legislature, never handled by referendum, compared to what other states have, particularly states in the West. They have a lot more decisions being made by voters on election day through referendum. And of course, the United States Constitution has no referendum provision, deciding whether or not we should provide health care to everybody, deciding whether or not we should legalize gay marriage. I mean, these could be questions, and they are in other jurisdictions, that are handled by referenda. But we, under our political system, do not have that. We do not have any provision for a national referendum. We've never, as a country, ever voted as a people on what to do. All those decisions are filtered through our national elected officials. And that's another way that some other countries do have a system. One last thing I'll mention, and I'll kick it back to you, is the two-party dominant system. If you think about a multi-party environment, you might have more people saying, hey, there's something I like here, I'm going to turn out. In Canada, you have 5 parties represented in Parliament. You have a choice that is more than just steak or chicken. Who would go to such a restaurant with 2 things on the menu? But we are asked to do that every November, right? Sure, there's libertarians who sometimes qualify for the ballot in some states, but not others. But the reality is that our 2-party dominant system, I think, also discourages people who might, really love to vote in an election where the libertarians have a chance or where the Green Party has a chance to win something. But in America, other than the occasional independent who pops up in Maine or Vermont, there just aren't that many opportunities for anything other than a Democrat or a Republican to win an election. And I think that also impacts that question of turnout.
I mean, Ross Perot was a viable contender there for a 5 minutes many years ago. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Farnsworth. This has been an enlightening conversation. I know that I am seeing things in a new, broader perspective. So hopefully, so are our viewers. We got a great lecture, and thanks for sharing on Facebook. And I echo that. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would encourage people to continue to leave comments on the Facebook post. If anybody has any burning questions, I will send them to you and we can get them answered. So again, thank you so much. And we will see all of you all again next month in February, on February 24th, for another virtual Stories of Preservation and Progress. Thank you so much, Dr. Farnsworth.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.